in Romans 6, and in verse number, I'm just going to read because it all runs together. And I'll say runs together, I mean in the course of thought. It says, "Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lust. And do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." And so at the bottom of whatever page it is, 2 or 3, question number 9, looking at, do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness. I was looking at this text again, and just by way of reminder, the word present is found twice in this text. And in the first instance of presenting your members as instruments of unrighteousness is in what's called the present active, which means you're doing it and you've done it and you're still doing it. And so what Paul's saying is, stop presenting yourselves continually as instruments of sin. And then the second, present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness. That verb is in what's called the aorist tense, which means to do a thing once and for all. Once and for all. And so what he's telling them is, make up your minds that you are going to do right all the time. In other words, don't always have to think about if you're going to do right or not. In other words, when the situation arises, you've already set it in your mind, I'm going to do right. No matter what it is that I have to do, the decision to do right is already made. That's what he's talking about here. And so, and I think I used as an example Brother Gus Nichols talking about when he obeyed the gospel. This was later in his life when he couldn't hear it thunder, and yet he'd still go to services every time the doors were open. And the point that he made was, he said, I made the decision to be at services when I obeyed the gospel. And that was a decision I only had to make one time. When I obeyed the gospel, I made that decision, and I never had to think about it again. And so that's what Paul's talking about here. Make that decision to do right, and then you don't have to make that decision again. Now that doesn't mean, and we'll talk about this as we move forward a little bit, doesn't mean you're never going to fail. But a lot of times when we sin, we actually have the situation presented before us, right? In other words, there is a time of consciousness where we deliberate as to what we're going to do, if it's right or wrong. Now, sometimes sin jumps on us, right? Your kids are driving you nuts. Now I know, Bianca, you don't know nothing about none of that. Jenny, I know y'all don't have any idea but one of these days you'll understand. But you understand that you've gone and you've gone and you've gone, and then there's what they call the straw that breaks the camel's back. Sometimes sin just jumps on you. It's not a matter of deliberation about as to what you're going to do. But sometimes people are presented with what am I going to do? Am I going to do right or am I going to do wrong? And so we want to make the decision. We're going to do right, whatever that decision, whatever that course of action is. We're going to present our members as instruments of righteousness. In large commentary on this verse, in fact, Lard, when he wrote his commentary, this is Moses Lard from the 1800s of the Restoration Movement. When he wrote his commentary on Romans, he also translated the book of Romans. Notice he translated the book from the original language and wrote a translation and then commented on it. And in his translation here, he says, presenting your members as instruments of wrong, rather than unrighteousness. Now, it's not that unrighteousness is ever right, or that unrighteousness can never be wrong. But in his mind, he's thinking there's no word that encompasses every aspect of negativity than wrong. Because sometimes we think about unrighteousness, we kind of categorize that into certain kinds of sin. It's just natural to do that. Like when Jesus said, "Ye that work iniquity." We think about iniquity and our mind goes to a certain category of sins, like maybe those in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10. Lord says, wrong. Notice, everything that is the antithesis of doing right. Because really, righteousness is what? What's righteousness? Doing right. That's right. Righteousness is just simply doing right. So to talk about the opposite of that, any kind of wrong, anything that appears wrong, feels wrong, seems wrong, or is in actuality wrong. He says, just make sure that you are as far from wrong as you can possibly be. That's what he's talking about here. And then I thought about what Whiteside said. By the way, if you just want two inexpensive, pretty easy to read commentaries on the book of Romans, Robertson Whiteside has a book on Romans, commentary on Romans, which is probably the easiest to read of any of them. All right? And then Moses Lard has his commentary on Romans, which is a little heavier than Whiteside's, but it's still nevertheless a good commentary. And then, if you really wanted to dig, Cottrell's commentary on Romans, in my opinion, is the standard. Cottrell's commentary is absolute greatness, all right? And so, reading Whiteside's commentary on this text, he says, he talks about, and this is going to move us into our next page and the next thoughts. He says, we do wrong in our bodies, but the wrong is not in the body. The wrong is in the heart. In other words, and here's how this is so funny, because this is a long, long time ago when he makes this comment, and here's what he says. He says, the instrument used in committing a crime cannot be blamed for the crime. Now, he said this like over 100 years ago. The instrument used in committing a crime is not blamed for the crime. The body is the instrument, but with regard to sin, the body is the instrument, but the force is the heart. Now, apparently he's never heard gun control argument, has he, Kyle? Because anytime there's a shooting, the gun gets blamed and the person that owns it and pulls the trigger never does. All right, so but of course, obviously we know better than that. But the point, I think, is well made, is that whatever we do in our body doesn't start in our bodies, it starts in our heart. And our body is just the instrument of what our heart desires to do. Jesus said, Jesus talked about, it's not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him, but what comes out. And then he goes on to say, for out of the mouth proceeds, adulteries and all these sins and he says, but all these things are actually the product of the heart. And so we want to, as the Proverbs writer said, we want to keep our heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. It's a great statement. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. All right, now over to question 10 on the next page, which is verse number 14. It says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Now, the text here, the context here, is speaking about a future time. Sin shall not have dominion over you. In other words, in the future. But even though he's speaking of the future, he's still also talking about the present. He says, because you are not under law, but under grace. So he's talking about the present. So ultimately he says there is no reason for sin to exercise control over us. There's no reason for us to allow sin to exercise control over us. Not now, and we don't need to fear the power of sin in the future, because we are not under law, but under grace. And the word dominion here comes from the root word meaning lordship. So Paul says, sin no longer lords its power over us, for we have escaped all such by means of grace. Now, man, I hear this a lot, especially in a lot of the discussions I have with regard to a lot of the comments that are on my the 1-minute Bible Q&As. You know, if I talk about original sin, or I talk about the need to obey the Lord, man, people are going to come out of the woodwork and they're going to say, you know, if you teach that you got to do anything to be saved, you're a false teacher. You know, you just hear that kind of foolishness all the time. And right here's where they're going to run to, Romans 6:14. You're not under law, but under grace. Except for the problem of the application is that Paul is talking about what we choose to do in our own bodies. Don't present your members as instruments of unrighteousness, but present your members as instruments of righteousness. Well, how can you talk about righteousness if there are no laws? And how can we talk about sin if there are no laws? Because sin is what? Transgression of the law. 1 John 3 and verse 4. And what is righteousness? Again, what's righteousness? Doing right. It's right living. Well, how do we know if we're living right? In other words, what's the standard of living right? The law. Now, there's a standard of living right in the world, but there's also a standard of living right in the church, in God's eyes. And if you're going to live righteous in God's eyes, it means you got to do what God says. And if you're doing what God says, you're obeying laws. And so this whole argument about there is no law, there's only grace, and there is no law, the easiest way to think about that, at least to me, is, you know, that which proves too much proves nothing at all. Now, look at this series of verses here as we think about this false idea that there's only grace and there is no law whatsoever. In Romans 4 and verse 15, the Bible says, where there is no law, there is no transgression. What's transgression? It's sin. It's going beyond what God says. That's what transgression is. So where there is no law, there's no transgression. Can a person transgress? Can he transgress as an unbeliever? Yep. Can he transgress as a believer? He can. So if he can transgress, then there has to be a what? Has to be a law. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. And yet the Bible tells us that we have all sinned and transgressed, the will of God. 1 John 3:4, I just mentioned this. Whoever sins transgresses the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. Can Christians sin? They most certainly can. The Bible says, talking to Christians, if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness, wrongdoing. Well, two mentions of sin and one mention of unrighteousness. Sounds like to me there's some laws that are being broken there. All right, number 3. We sin when we give in to our own, what? Desires or lusts, and are enticed. Depending on what translation read, says, every one of us is drawn away by our own lust, or sin when we're drawn away by our own lust, and enticed, and lust when it's conceived brings forth sin. And sin when it is finished brings forth death. It's James 1:13-15. Now 1 John 1:7. Christians, now you had to put this one together because it's not a direct quotation. You had to read the verse and figure out how to fill in the blanks. Christians sin even while what? Walking in the light. Christians sin even while walking in the light. It says, if we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, His Son, cleanses us from all sin. So just because I sin doesn't mean that I have quit walking in the light and am now walking in darkness. Now, when I quit walking in the light, then I'm walking in darkness. And when I'm walking in darkness, there is no forgiveness. There's no forgiveness. But the point that I'm getting at is that Christians sin even while walking in the light. All right? So, should we conclude that there is no law of any kind for Christians today? No. Should we conclude, as some, that it's impossible for Christians to sin? No. No. And some, by the way, some mistakenly use 1 John 3 and verse 9 to speak about this matter of that Christians cannot sin, and it fails to understand the literal meaning of the text. It says that those that are born of God cannot sin. What the text is saying literally is those that are born of God cannot keep walking in sin. You can't do that. But when it says you can't do that, it doesn't mean it's impossible for you to do that. It says you can't do that. If you want to be, if you want to be born of God, you just can't keep sinning. You can't just keep on sinning and sinning. All right. Now this is an interesting thing I found in Whiteside's commentary on this verse. He says this phrase, "You are not under law but under grace," says this is a figure of speech in which what is lesser is denied in order to explain what is greater. And he's talking about the difference between law and grace. Law is the lesser and grace is the greater. And so he makes a statement denying the lesser to emphasize the greater. I'd never heard that before, but it seems to make sense. All right? Now, last paragraph here. The transition from law to grace does not leave us free to sin, as if there were no longer any law at all by which sin is defined and restrained. This is this quote from Cottrell, by the way. Accepting grace means the abandonment of the law system as a way of salvation, but it does not separate us from law altogether. Under grace, the commands of the law are still operative as a binding norm, identifying the limits and requirements of accepted behavior. In other words, we're saved, we accept and believe that we are saved by grace. But yet at the same time, we also understand that our acceptance of the grace of God still means we have boundaries. In other words, just because we accept the grace of God and are desiring to live in the grace of God doesn't mean that we can just do whatever we want. Now, that's the whole theme of chapter 6, if we just want to get right down to it. That's how chapter 6 starts. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. In other words, don't keep on sinning. And then look at verse 15. In light of it goes right back to verse 15. It's almost a restatement of verse 1. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under law, but under grace? Again, King James, God forbid, or certainly not. So even under God's grace system, there are still boundaries that we have to observe. There are things that we must do, and there are things that we must not do. So there are boundaries under which that we all must live. So then, of course, I just read you verse 15, which is question 11. Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? Certainly not. I made the reference back to chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, or back to verses 1 and 2 because we're in chapter 6. And the second sentence there, one must be careful not to understand law strictly in the sense of the law of Moses. The vast majority of the world was never subject to that law. So as grace was universally accessible as an antidote to law, the law here must, under consideration, must apply to all men. Paul, in his opening 3 chapters of this book, condemns all men under sin, Jews and Gentiles. The church at Rome was comprised of Jews and Gentiles. All right? And so we want to make sure, because look, sometimes when we read the word law, it's talking about the law of Moses. But in this case, where it's being contrasted with grace, it means any law system. I mean, where the Gentiles weren't under the Mosaic law. Is that correct? But just because they weren't under the Mosaic law, does that mean they weren't under any law at all? No. In fact, Romans 2 talks about that they were even under the law of their own conscience. In Romans chapter 2, beginning right around in verse 15 or so. Yeah. The Gentiles were under law to God, even though they weren't under the law of Moses. Look, just by way of Old Testament example, read the book of Amos. In the book of Amos, Amos condemns 7 Gentile nations for their sins, despite the fact that they were not under the law of Moses. And he enumerated their sins. There's a phrase that occurs repeatedly in Amos, for 3 transgressions and for 4. Just a kind of an introductory phrase saying, I'm not going to just single out one thing, and not just 2 things, and not just 3 things. We're going to talk about 4 things. All right? For 3 transgressions and for 4. And then he enumerates those sins. And so these Gentile nations fell under condemnation under God, even though they had never violated the law of Moses because they weren't under the law of Moses. But if they committed transgressions, that means they were under some type of law system. Now, just as a quick aside, no Gentile nation was ever condemned for violating the Sabbath. And yet the Jews were continually condemned for profaning the Sabbath. Now, why didn't the prophets condemn the Gentiles for violating the Sabbath? Because it wasn't a part of their law. Sabbath belonged to the Jews. It didn't belong to the Gentiles. And so, that's just a quick aside. But the point of the matter is, both Jews and Gentiles were under some type of law system, both of which were nullified or dominated in a way by the law of grace. All right? Let's look at question 12. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey his slave you are to whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or obedience leading to righteousness? Okay, now, the idea of presenting yourselves, note there, presenting yourselves as slaves to obey. The picture here is that that we bind ourselves to do the will of somebody. When you present yourself to somebody in this sense as a slave, you're presenting yourself saying, whatever you want me to do is what I'm going to do. So you present yourself as a slave either to sin and obey sin, or you present yourself as a slave to righteousness or obedience and do what's right. In other words, how are you going to present yourself? how are you going to enter into that presence as one submissive to a master? And then the note here is, all men are slaves, either to law or grace. In this sense, we are slaves in the same way as the voluntary slave of Exodus. There's a passage in Exodus 21:6 where a man who is a slave, who could be made free, chooses to remain a slave. And in so doing, there was a process that they went through, and one of those things was they put their earlobe in the doorpost and they punched a hole in their earlobe. And this was the sign, the visible sign, that you made a conscious decision not to enter into freedom, but to remain a slave. You say, well, why would anybody do that? Well, could be any number of reasons. Number one, you might have a good master. Somebody's going to take care of you. Because there wasn't a welfare system to fall back on if you didn't have a job. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. If you didn't work, you didn't have a place to live. So a guy might decide staying in my master's house is better than going out and trying to make it on my own. By the way, this happens all the time in the prison system. People can't handle it in the free world. They've been institutionalized for so long. They've had somebody cooking them 3 squares a day, providing everything for them. They get out and they find it's too hard for them to assimilate back into the regular world. And a lot of them intentionally commit crimes in order to be reincarcerated. So that's one reason somebody might choose to be a slave. Another reason a man might choose to be a slave is if while he's a slave he marries, just because he goes free doesn't mean his wife goes free. And if he and his wife have any children, they don't get to go free. So a man might decide, you know what, I think I'd rather be a slave and stay with my wife and children. And thus, go through that process. I'm going to choose to get a hole punched in my ear, so that people will know, that I've chosen this life. And so we choose to be slaves, rather than being taken against our will and sold into servitude or slavery. Note also this: consider the exercise of free will in committing sin that leads to death, while the exercise of that same free will in our obedience that leads to righteousness. In other words, if you live wrong, it's your choice. And if you live right, it's your choice. Nobody gets to blame someone else for the life that they live. And then this is a note from one of the commentators. I think it was Whiteside. Says, God does not force us or coerce us to accept the freedom purchased on our behalf. In other words, God's paid the price to secure our freedom from sin. But He doesn't force anybody to take it. He doesn't coerce anybody to take it. We have to make the choice as to whether or not we're going to accept the freedom that He has so graciously paid for on our behalf. And then lastly this, and I'll stop with this one. Note the dichotomy of the choices. There are only two. There are only two. There's no third. There's no C. It's A or B. It's one or two. It's left or right. All right. It says there are only two choices. There is no partial choosing or blending of choices. Paul is clear that we are either all in on sin or we are all in on obedience. Ain't no fence riding on this thing. We're either all in for the Lord or we're all in for the devil. There is no middle ground. This is also clear from verse 18, wherein Paul says that those who are slaves to sin are free from righteousness. The word free there means It doesn't mean free in the sense of being released. It means free in the sense that we don't have any association with it. All right? We're free from righteousness. So to be free of a thing is to possess no part of it. But being all in on obedience does not mean that we will never sin, as noted in our study of verse 14. It means our heart's desire and ongoing intention is to live and do as those who are slaves to the Lord. All right, any thoughts or questions on that? All right, next week we will finish this chapter, picking up in verse 17 and moving through verse 23. And I should have at least some of chapter 7 finished to hand out for the week that follows that. You recovered yet?